Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today as we present an overview of our recent publication, Changing the Landscape. Today, we will also update you on a forthcoming new national funding initiative, People, Parks, and Power, a national initiative for green space, health equity, and racial justice. Both the paper and the national initiative are funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, or RWJF for short, and we'll be referring to them that way throughout the webinar. My name is Manal Abalata. I am Deputy Executive Director of Prevention Institute. I'm very pleased that we're here today with you and happy to introduce you to my colleagues and co-author of this paper and co-conspirators on this initiative. We are joined today by Elva Yanez, Prevention Institute Director of Health Equity, and Rachel Bennett, Program Manager. Dr. Alessandro Rigolone of the University of Utah's Department of City and Metropolitan Planning, also a co-author and project partner, was unable to join us today. I'm also very pleased to introduce you to Sam Brad, who leads Drawing Change Consulting Incorporated. Sam will visually document today's webinar, and in just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Sam to explain the process. I also just want to acknowledge the many folks on our team who are working behind the scenes to help make this webinar happen, who helped with registration and will be supporting note-taking, namely Vanessa Shee and Maddie Dolin. Thank you both for being with us today. And I also want to just mention that we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for people who want to see it afterward. You should have received that notification when you join, but I just wanted to let you know that we are recording. Sam, now I'd like to turn it over to you. And again, thank you so much for being here. We're enthusiastic to have your expertise with us.
Thank you so much, Manal. My role today is to listen deeply and then to translate the ideas into visuals. I believe that storytelling can be made visual, and I'm passionate that great meetings can be even better with creativity.
Jake, come here.
So you'll be able to view my drawings today by watching my Zoom square. So this square here will become the drawings. And if you want to follow closely along, you can pin my video in Zoom as an option. And at the end of the meeting, I'll be able to screen share the whole graphic and we'll be able to interact with it then. Back to you, Manal.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I'll just note that we first met Sam at another convening, and we're so thrilled by the addition of Sam's visual excellence at the meeting. So I hope you will take full advantage of paying attention to the mural that Sam is developing. Thank you again, Sam. Our goals for today are really to share highlights from our new paper. We want to take time to describe for you the rationale that we have for the importance of advancing a policy and systems change approach to reversing park and green space inequities that are too frequently experienced in Black, Brown, and low-income communities across the United States. Secondly, we're going to take some time to share with you a little bit about People, Parks, and Power, or what we are now calling the P3 initiative, which is a forthcoming national funding initiative which we will officially launch with a call for proposals in September. If you have any questions during today's webinar, we are asking that you type them into the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to answer some of the questions in writing in the Q&A box. Some we'll talk through as time permits during the Q&A session that follows at the end of the presentation that Elva, Rachel, and I will be delivering right now. Moving on to the next slide. One of the reasons that it was so important to bring this forward is that we just feel that this is an unprecedented moment. We've all long felt the value of parks and green spaces, but in the era during the pandemic, it became even clearer to all how important these spaces are. So Changing the Landscape, the paper, was written with resources from RWJF, and the idea was to lay the conceptual groundwork for the People, Parks, and Power initiative. Based on our decades of experience advancing park equity, we feel that this initiative really comes at a critical and unprecedented time in our nation's history. We are also very hopeful that with the resources and reputation of RWJF behind it, this initiative has the potential to accelerate and transform how we address park and green space inequities in the highest need communities all across the United States. Our hope is that RWJF's resources will not only support action to advance park policy advocacy and park and green space equity across the country, but also will inspire other foundations and philanthropic institutions, as well as agencies, to engage more deeply and systematically in policy and systems change work in service of health equity and racial justice. As we wrote Changing the Landscape and conceptualized this initiative, we grounded both in what we are calling an upstream policy and systems change approach to emphasize the need to reverse the policies, the practices, the norms, and the mindsets that have led to these inequities in African American, Latino, and low-income urban communities in the first place. We developed the paper to really articulate the initiative's policy and systems change approach. We recognize that this is a bit of a departure from the way that things have typically been done in the field. In our experience, the field has emphasized, for the most part, a project-based approach that focuses on absolutely critical functions such as land acquisition, land preservation, development of individual brick and mortar projects, as well as operations and maintenance. But we also know from the available data and our own national scan that persistent and widespread inequities in access to parks and open space call for additional strategies and approaches. The policy and systems change approach we articulate builds on Prevention Institute's work to advance health equity and racial justice, and it applies lessons learned from other public health successes. In particular, we look to tobacco prevention and control, where we have accelerated national momentum and improved health outcomes across the population. In this initiative, we will also be centering proven power-building strategies that have been honed by generations of racial justice, social justice, and environmental justice advocates that have been working to transform and create community change. Power building will be an essential part of our approach to this initiative. To describe more about what we mean when we say upstream approach, I'm going to turn it over to Elva. Elva?
Thank you, Manal. Here we go. There. Thank you, Manal. And as Manal said, in this segment of the webinar, I'm going to provide some context and then go over more detail about the upstream approach. Please note that we're using the phrase green spaces as shorthand to cover urban parks, playgrounds, outdoor recreation areas, urban trails and open space gardens, and stormwater infrastructure, among other types of green space. As most of you are aware, green spaces are essential community infrastructure that protect health and promote well-being by providing people opportunities for physical activity, time in nature, and social connections. Green spaces also provide climate benefits. They cool temperatures, filter air, remove pollution, filter stormwater, and replenish groundwater. Green spaces should serve every community in a fair, just, and safe manner. Unfortunately, not all communities have access to safe, well-maintained, and programmed green spaces. Many studies are out there that show that Blacks, Latinos, and others who live in low-income urban neighborhoods have less access to green spaces than people who live in more affluent or predominantly white neighborhoods. The root causes of these inequities include systemic racism, long-standing imbalances in political and economic power, and opportunities to affect the allocation of resources. This graphic presents these structural drivers as gears, and like gears, the policies and practices underlying green space inequities interact with and exacerbate each other over time. Some of the historical factors contributing to green space inequities are shown here and include racial segregation, biased planning decision, exclusionary zoning, and redlining, among others. Excuse me. There are also present-day factors contributing to green spaces inequities. These include shifting responsibility for public services, the reduced ability of low-income cities with limited tax bases to provide green space services, as well as the anti-tax movement. In addition, these drivers of inequity can be reinforced by the institutional culture of agencies and organizations that are responsible for developing, operating, or funding green spaces. Reversing green spaces requires that we go beyond the moral arguments for equity. With power building as our starting point and communities most impacted by the problems of park inequities in the lead, several broad categories of action are necessary, such as researching green space inequities and vetting them with residents and other key stakeholders, analyzing the policies and practices that contributed to these inequities, developing winnable policy strategies to address the problems, running effective policy campaigns, again with those most impacted in the lead, and monitoring the implementation of such policies to ensure their enactment results in the kinds of results that we're looking for. We found that it's very helpful to have a deeper understanding of the causes of inequity as a first step in the process of identifying potential solutions. PI's health equity framework, shown here, draws from an equity model advanced by both scholars and practitioners. It has relevance to the policy and systems change approach that will be the focus of the P3 initiative, as Manal said, and hopefully inspire action outside of the initiative itself. These three objectives are key to understanding the root causes of inequities, as well as how to reverse them through policy and systems change efforts. These three objectives include procedural equity, distributional equity, and structural equity. Procedural equity involves decision-making processes related to all aspects of green space functions that are transparent, equitable, and inclusive with regard to who participates, how they're engaged, and how their input is valued and applied. It also covers provision of services, including maintenance, operations, and programming. Targeted community engagement is a good example of procedural equity and really sort of getting the input and raising the voices of communities that have traditionally been left out of decision-making related to green space design, development, and/or operations. Moving on to distributional equity, this is often the first thing that people think about when they consider park and green space equity, because it's the most readily quantifiable and visible. It covers spatial distribution of actual green spaces, as well as fiscal allocation of resources of all kinds. Parcel taxes, sale taxes, and other kinds of assessments enacted by voters that include resources to create more green space infrastructure in the communities lacking it are examples of distributional equity. This image shows the expenditure plan for LA County's park funding measure of 2016. It sets aside 13% of the revenue generated for investments in LA County's highest park need communities. Structural equity is less quantifiable than the other forms of equity and addresses the underlying structural factors and policies that give rise to green space inequities in the first place. Structural equity makes a commitment to correct past harms and prevent future unintended consequences. For example, the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board has been working on equity since 2011. Its Racial Equity Action Plan is updated every 2 years and establishes priorities, timelines, accountability, and performance measures to ensure it meets its equity goals for internal transformational change. Now I'm going to turn it back to Manal to talk a little bit more about the critical challenges of moving upstream to address policy and systems change for green space equity. And that challenge is the tension between policy and projects. Manal?
Thanks, Elva. As we mentioned earlier, the policy and systems change approach of the P3 initiative is deeply embedded in lessons from the field of public health. Time and again, this approach has been instrumental in addressing critical public health problems, including in movements to limit the negative effects of tobacco, alcohol, traffic crashes, and firearms. While parks and green space are in many ways very different than, say, the problems of tobacco or traffic, we have found important parallels that we believe can add tremendous value in the parks and green space arena. For example, over time, each of these movements had to shift their strategies from a focus on individual behaviors to broader scale population level approaches. And now, to achieve large scale impacts for park and green space equity, a similar shift is needed. There are other lessons to glean as well. One of them is the importance of shifting from a focus on individual park units to policies that shape the environment in which projects are built, developed, and maintained. Another important lesson is the importance of seizing political opportunities associated with local policy action and systems change. And a third is about using power building strategies in policy advocacy campaigns led by and engaging the people most impacted by the problem. Through our participation in park and green space equity efforts, we have noted some very distinct differences between the policy and systems change approach on one hand and individual green space development projects on the other. In the Changing the Landscape paper, we delineate the distinct roles and impacts of these two approaches in advancing green space equity and racial justice outcomes. And we begin to depict them in the slide and describe them in greater detail in the paper. Our point here is in no way to minimize the importance of park and green space development. Rather, it is to amplify the critical importance of creating a policy environment and reimagining systems so that they more actively support and accelerate equitable park and green space development. As awareness of green space inequity has grown, many local agencies, nonprofits, and partnerships have undertaken green space projects like transforming vacant land into parks. And they've initiated programs such as sponsoring recreational classes in underserved communities. These efforts are critically important. And in our national scan conducted for Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we also found that more and more nonprofits and agencies are beginning to focus on policy and systems changes to address the systemic drivers of green space inequities that Elva referred to in the slide with the gears, but still at a much reduced level compared to their project-oriented work. While brick and mortar projects and recreational programming are critically important and essential to reversing unfair and unjust green space inequities, these approaches are not designed to shine a spotlight on or reverse the policies and practices that created inequities in the first place, or the things that reinforce them today. So our point is that policy and systems change is critical to accelerating momentum for equity. Building new and improving existing green spaces in low-income communities of color is essential, and we hope that we've made that clear. But as this quote indicates, We cannot build our way out of this situation, especially on a project-by-project basis. So while we absolutely need new parks and green spaces, and we must improve existing facilities in high communities, there is a downside to focusing exclusively on park development to reduce inequities. Project work alone leaves the root causes of inequity firmly in place. They do not allow us to identify, analyze, or take steps to reverse the policies, practices, and norms that created and then reproduced these inequities in the first place. That's why we believe that taking a policy and systems change approach to addressing park equity will actually result in even more projects and high quality programming in the highest need communities. And that will get us closer to achieving equity at scale if we focus on the procedural and structural and distributional equity considerations that Elva mentioned earlier. So just to summarize this segment, policy change gets to the root causes of park and green space inequities. Policy change addresses the range of procedural, distributional, and structural inequities. And policy change creates opportunities for transformation at the population or community level. Elva, why don't you take it over now to talk more about equity-focused local policy?
Thanks, Manal. So equity-focused policy and systems change work with highly impacted residents in the lead can result in important outcomes, including, among others, changes to the dominant green space narrative, altered power relationships, and momentum to rectify inequities in Black, Brown, and low-income communities. Ultimately, we believe, as Manal said, that effective policy and systems change work will incentivize building and renovating more brick and mortar projects in the highest need communities. But projects aren't the central focus of the P3 funding initiative. Our North Star is to achieve equity at scale. As we plan the new P3 initiative, we conducted a scan of local policies that address green space inequities at the city, county, and district level. As Manal said, growing numbers of jurisdictions have enacted and community-based organizations have successfully advocated for ordinances, finance measures, administrative laws, and other kinds of local policies. Local policy change for green space equity is absolutely possible. And we can build on this momentum to support more communities to do policy and systems change work, and importantly, coalesce as a national network, a new movement for park and green space equity. Our paper organizes these examples into a typology to show the kinds of local policies that are currently being enacted. These policies and their outcomes are encouraging signs of readiness for upstream policy and systems change in this arena. We believe the 3P initiative will inspire more communities to replicate what's already working and innovate further. A number of these policies have originated from within park agencies or governing bodies like city councils or county commissions, and then garnered support from community groups. Other policies have emerged from proactive community-based organizations, consistent with the approach outlined in our paper, where groups advance a policy advocacy process and, for example, conduct their own research, build coalitions, and then gain the support of agencies and elected officials to serve as their champions. For example, a decade ago in Fresno, California, a group of youth, community residents, and local organizations began organizing around the issues of parks. They conducted an inventory documenting stark inequities in park access and quality across neighborhoods. Fresno for Parks, a diverse, nonpartisan group of residents, gathered more than 35,000 signatures to place a 3/8 sales tax on the November 2018 ballot. Measure P received 52% voter approval for a guaranteed local funding source of $38 million per year for parks in this Central California jurisdiction. There was controversy and legal maneuvering after the initial vote, but ultimately the measure was certified. a victory not only for the coalition and youth leaders, but the entire community, which will benefit from additional resources to build more park space. As an example of government-initiated policy, the City of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board jointly enacted a series of ordinances to achieve a shared goal of closing gaps in neighborhood park funding. An important element was codification of objective criteria to determine the distribution of funds to neighborhood parks during the period covered by the plan. And these criteria are updated on a regular basis. Unfortunately, we don't have the time on this webinar to share other policies, but you can find more examples in the Changing the Landscape publication, which I urge you to read if you haven't already. And so now we're going to shift gears and hear from Rachel Bennett, who's going to give us a brief update on the P3 National Funding Initiative and the call for proposals that will be coming out in September. Thank you.
Thanks, Elva. Since December of 2020, Prevention Institute and our partner, Dr. Rigolone of the University of Utah, have been working with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to plan the People, Parks, and Power National Funding Initiative. During that time, we conducted a national landscape analysis, which included interviewing 28 subject matter experts working all across the US. And as Elva said, doing a scan of equitable park and green space policies that have been adopted in jurisdictions across the country. We also wrote the Changing the Landscape framing paper to capture what we heard in the National Landscape Analysis and to lay out the theoretical framework for the P3 initiative. And we developed a theory of change for P3, which we'll be releasing soon. We are now in the process of working with the foundation to finalize the call for proposals, which I will tell you more about in just a moment. We're really honored and excited to have this role with the foundation, and we're looking forward to sharing more information about the P3 National Funding Initiative with you all in the coming weeks. So for now, we just want to give a quick overview of what the P3 initiative is intended to fund, and also mention a few key dates in the application timeline so you know when to mark your calendars. As Elva said before, the North Star of People, Parks, and Power is upstream policy and systems change, not on-the-ground projects, so not planning, building, or operating individual park projects or green infrastructure projects. Instead, P3 will support community-based organizations and base building groups working in urban, low-income communities of color across the US to increase park and green space equity through local policy and systems change. The call for proposals that RWJF is going to be releasing in September will include a lot more specific information on who is eligible to apply for a P3 grant and how to apply. But since we know that a number of you all here today with us on this webinar work within public agencies, we did just want to clarify that P3 will be funding 501c3 organizations. So again, community-based organizations, base building groups, nonprofits, not funding for government agencies. But we do hope that you all who work within public agencies will help spread the word about this new funding opportunity to your community partners, and that you'll share the call for proposals widely with your community-based partners as soon as it's released. So as I said, there's going to be a lot more information in that call for proposals document about eligibility criteria, how to apply, and what the goals of the P3 initiative are. And I'll just mention a couple of key dates coming up. One other thing to note is that it's going to be a two-stage application process. First, all applicants will be asked to submit a letter of intent, or LOI. Then the LOIs will be reviewed by the foundation. And then a select number of applicants will be invited to proceed to the second stage of the process and invited to submit a full proposal. In terms of the timeline for the application process, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation will be releasing the P3 call for proposals on Wednesday, September 8th. Everyone who's registered for this webinar today, including folks who registered but were unable to join us live, you are all now on our email listserv, and so you'll receive an email announcement on September 8th with a link to the call for proposals. It will also be posted on RWJS website, publicized through their social media, publicized through Prevention Institute's social media, and linked from our website. Another date to mention is that on September 22nd, we'll be hosting an optional webinar for prospective applicants. And we strongly encourage anyone who is thinking about applying for the P3 funding opportunity to please attend that webinar. It will be recorded, and that recording will be posted on RWJF's website and linked on Prevention Institute's website, but that's where we will go into much more detail about the call for proposals and how to apply. And then one last date to mention for now, October 28th will be the deadline to submit a letter of intent, so an LOI. Again, call for proposals will explain what an LOI should include. It'll spell out formatting guidelines and selection criteria and all that. So much more information is to come soon in just about 6 weeks. But for now, please mark your calendar for the call for proposals release date on Wednesday, September 8th, and that applicant webinar on Wednesday, September 22nd. And please help us spread the word to any of your community-based partners who might be interested in learning about this funding opportunity, and let them know that this is going to be coming down the pike from RWJF. Now, I am going to ask Sam to please share the graphic that he's been creating here on our main screen. He's going to take over so you'll be able to see a larger version of the graphic, and let you all know about how you can give feedback on what you see.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm so pleased to be able to share the graphic that's in progress so far. And so what we have here is the idea of a system based on roots. And so what we have are people walking through a park, racialized folks walking through a park, and then underneath, when we go down, looking at the roots that need to be analyzed for what the root causes are. And then the equity framework supports that underneath. So looking at procedural equity, distributional equity, structural equity. And then underneath that again is power building strategies and some of the examples of projects that are doing that in communities across the country. Looking to the experts map and other types of work that might be supported here. And I really heard about the North Star. So the North Star is about equity at scale. And so underneath this playground, the playground is what's visible on the surface, but again, supporting that is going to be power building strategies, a policy change, a systems lens, and what I'm going to do as the question and answers begin to fill in, I'm going to fill in some of the information about next steps and the details of the program and the report overall. So what I'm going to do right now is to put in the chat a link to something called a website called Mural. And you don't have to sign up for anything. What you can do is click the link and then you'll see the graphic up close on your own computer. And you can use, I see people are coming in, this is great. And you can use the Post-it notes to add feedback and comment or add things that you think might improve the graphic. And so if you don't feel like learning a new tool today, that's totally fine. I'll be able to screen share the graphic at the end. But if you'd like to come on in and zoom around, I really welcome your feedback. We can pretend that we're having coffee at the side of the room, looking at the pictures together. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Sam. This is great.
Thank you, Sam and Rachel. We are going to move into the Q&A session. And as we do that, there's a number of questions that have been answered, as well as a couple open ones. I'm going to queue those up and kind of half moderate, half help with answering. And as we sort of pivot into that, I want to just echo something I said earlier that for all of us, I think in the last 18 months, the pandemic has reinforced, I think for those maybe who for this wasn't such a front burner issue, just how essential parks and green space are for health, physical health, mental well-being, for safety, and many things. And I think particularly concurrent with the national reckoning around racial justice, this has really created a massive shift in how people, whether at agencies or in the public, as well as foundations, think about structural inequities and what we can do to really reverse their impact on Black, Brown, and other communities of color. And so we do feel that this is a really critical and unprecedented opportunity to make significant and lasting change. And we're really looking forward to working with many of you in the broad scale work that's needed to really accomplish that change. So we thank you for being here and thank you for the work that you do. With that, I want to turn to the Q&A. I want to first just pick one that I saw, and let me see, I need to scroll around a little bit. Let's see, Elva, I'm going to actually kick this one to you, which was a question about whether we considered including water and blue spaces. And I'm actually not saying, marine protected areas. Gia Lu asked, were marine protected areas, marine blue spaces also considered as part of P3? And Elva, you answered it, but I think it would be great to do an audible.
Sure. So in our call for proposals, we have a glossary, and included in the definition of green spaces, we include lakes, streams, riverbanks, as well as trails, greenways, etc. So yes, the answer is yes.
Thank you. Rachel, I'm going to turn this one to you. Is this focused on cities of a certain size?
So the call of proposals will explain this in a bit more detail, but given the foundation's focus, yes, the P3 funding initiative is intended to support park equity, policy and systems change work driven by communities in small and mid-sized cities, which means cities of population less than 500,000, as well as distinct disinvested communities in larger cities. So it's a little bit vague, but I think that it means that there's openness to, a neighborhood within a larger city where there are stark park and green space inequities. That would be a focus. But again, the policy and systems change focus means that we're probably going a little bit further upstream, passing, or looking to advance a citywide policy, for example, or a funding measure or organizational practice change, that because it specifically targets equity, it would have benefits for that particular neighborhood. So I think, the intention there is to encourage folks who are based in small and mid-sized cities to also see themselves as part of this initiative. But people in larger cities are welcome to apply as well.
Thank you, Rachel. And as we, launch the actual CFP there, as Rachel mentioned, there'll be a webinar and we'll do an FAQ and we'll do whatever we can to clarify some of those more specific selection criteria. I want to raise for us a challenging issue that Lauren McCullough raises in the Q&A, which we know from our work does not have an easy answer. So this is a challenging format, but I do think it's something we'll encounter and continue to encounter in this work. Lauren asks, how do we balance prioritizing improvements to green space parks in historically underinvested communities with homelessness? She says, there are several parks in low-income areas in my community that have become safe places for the homeless to congregate and camp. police usher them out. The local park and rec is trying to clean up and make improvements to help these parks become activated so they will remain in use. Many low-income community members just want a safe place for their families, and yet it's at the cost of the homeless or people, unhoused people. It's become a real touch point here. Alva, do you want to
Sure.
chime in with that, and I can back up if anything is needed?
Sure. So when we did our planning process for this, we interviewed about 30 subject matter experts from all across the country, as Rachel showed. And we really heard this sense that in low-income communities of color, parks can and should be used as hubs for resilience and going broader than just, traditional recreational services and respite. And so the challenge we find as, our world changes from, what it was in the, I guess, the golden age of parks and recreation, when homelessness wasn't, or unhoused people were not, as a critical problem as it is today. We have to envision parks as these hubs of resilience. And we saw some of that emerging during the pandemic, where they were sites for food distribution, testing, COVID testing, after school programs, or serving in lieu of childcare when frontline workers had to go to work. So, we have, just as we see the preponderance of inequities in low-income communities of color, there are other related or aligned issues. And so we have to think differently about what parks mean in today's society. Not only do we need to eliminate inequities, but we also need to find solutions to problems that are closely related. So I'll stop there and let Manal sort of build on that.
Thanks. And thanks for the question, Lauren. I mean, this is obviously a really tough issue that in many ways, I think a lot of locales will have to grapple with the challenges and solutions that they face as they find them in the situation where they are. I'm imagining that when we get to the point of funding grantee sites through, or RWJF gets to the point of funding grantee sites through the P3 initiative, that many of them will encounter a similar situation that you're describing. And then on the other end, and I don't even know if it's the other end, but on that same spectrum, also face the intersection between concerns around housing affordability, gentrification, and parks and park policies. One of the places that we talked to during the national scan in our subject matter experts, it was an agency representative, and they had done some pretty amazing and significant work around trying to bridge some of the gaps between being a park and rec agency and also sort of not being in control of or being able to solve for the issue of shelter, housing, affordable and quality housing, and collaborating with the local housing agency. But one of the challenges that they faced was, there's a lot of things that are outside of their purview. And so I think that we are going to see innovation and solutions emerging. Lastly, before I move on, I think one of the other groups that we interviewed was a community-based group that does youth organizing. And I think the executive director may even be on the call, so I don't want to, overstate, but they had been doing some pretty amazing work in working with their young people as well as their park agency partners, and saying that as they activated the space, a solution that a desirable solution for them wasn't just to kick out all the homeless people, as you said, and clean up, as under the auspices of cleanup. And they wanted to find a way for their youth activation and organizing to be very humane and inclusive of the unhoused individuals that were using the spaces. And so I just think that there's going to be a lot of creativity and community innovation, but there's no question we are in the middle of a national, if not international, housing affordability crisis that is, along with the pandemic, that is accelerating the challenges and the scarcity around dealing with homelessness. And so we will have to look at policy, systems change, innovation that kind of, as we say, creates good problems that solve, good solutions that solve multiple problems. So thank you for that. I want to keep us moving. Our old colleague, Rachel Banner, asked the question, Elva, I'll turn to you, which is how is RWJF and PI collaborating with other organizations like national organizations to ensure that the P3 efforts will build off, push, and collaborate with momentum of other organizations on the issues of in this arena, Park and Green Space Initiative?
Great question. And sorry you can't see me. I don't know if we can fix that. So there's going to be different touch points for collaboration with other organizations, not only national organizations, but, you know, park practitioners across the country as well. And so one of the things that we'll be doing is working with our national partners to disseminate the call for proposals. That is a critical piece to get the word out. One of the challenges that we face is that there isn't a pre-existing national database of folks who work on this issue or who are working on aligned issues. So we would love your help, and all the national organizations' help in spreading the word, you know, across their constituencies, but really focusing in on the groups that would be the, you know, ones that we would love to see applications from. Those base building and community-based organizations operating at the local level who are doing good green equity work. So that's one piece. The other piece is that we are going to be having a very robust technical assistance program that will provide you know, our grantees the support they need to be successful. But then we're also thinking of, well, not thinking, we are going to be creating sort of a collaborative learning group with some of our national partners on the issue of park equity, park and green space equity. And we're also going to be providing technical assistance in the form of these kinds of online learning experiences for park practitioners. And the goal of all of this is that we want to make sure that our partners are successful in operationalizing equity. We find that becomes, it's very easy to talk about equity at the beginning of, say, a public finance measure, right? Yeah, we're going to distribute this money. We're going to make sure it gets to the communities that have the highest park need. But when it actually comes to making that happen, operationalizing equity, that's where it starts to become a challenge for institutions, both, you know, agencies as well as large nonprofits. There's just many things that have to be taken into consideration and changed to be able to operationalize equity. And according to, you know, the analysis that should be done, you know, using that equity framework we described earlier. So you'll be hearing more about that, but absolutely we are going to be partnering and collaborating and building capacity with our partners out in the world who have been doing this work for a long time.
Thanks, Elva. And we are getting into our final 10-minute home stretch. So I'm going to pull, I think, or am I wrong about that, Elva? I'm looking at your eyes.
Yeah, I think it's 11:30, isn't it?
Oh, good. We have a lot more time. Sorry about that, everybody. So we have some great questions. I was just going to say we'll get to what we can, and what we don't, we will put in an FAQ. But more importantly, we hope to stay in dialogue with all of you who are part of this work, broadly speaking. I want to elevate a question, amplify a question from Gia Locke-Pratt, who is doing some amazing work in her own right. She asks, policies can be difficult to change if the political actors are not aligned with policy changes. I'm wondering if you can speak to other system change strategies that could be an example.
I guess I will take that. So yeah, you know, one of the things that we found, I worked in tobacco control for many years, and, you know, I provided technical assistance to groups over that time. And even in very conservative small communities, Helena, Montana, Fort Collins, Colorado, Albany, Georgia. And really what needs to happen is that you don't start off in a community like that with a policy initiative, like right off the bat, right? You don't go to a council member and say, hey, let's start doing this, park equity stuff. You have to build your capacity, you have to build support. And so we're taking that into consideration in this initiative. And it really does take a lot of engagement, organizing, education, building resident and allies capacity with regard to the issue of park equity, and then cultivating elected leaders, agency partners to be aligned. Park equity should be a nonpartisan issue, right? It's sort of like everybody deserves the opportunity to have a well-maintained, safe park in their neighborhood. And that kind of messaging is a bit different. And that frame and messaging is different than the current dominant narrative that we see happening in many communities, which is that parks are niceties, not necessities. And part of the work involved in this initiative will be changing that narrative to one of parks are essential community infrastructure, and everybody should have fair and safe access to them. So I could go on and on about that, but please take a look at our paper. And absolutely, it's difficult work, and you have to be methodical and strategic in building the support and changing the narratives and bringing on your champions.
Thanks, Elva. And I actually think a lot of the answer that you just provided really speaks a lot to what Alfredo Gonzalez from here in Los Angeles asked, which he asked some specific questions about the grant, which we'll just hold off for a minute because I think that'll become clear when the CFP is launched. But his point, I think the big point is system change at the level envisioned takes many years to realize. And we are totally aware of that, as Elva said, and in response to Gia's question. And so what we're going to be looking for, I think, in that and really emphasizing with RWJF is the key here is progress along a continuum. So it's not that at the end of the grant period, every grantee will have a slam dunk policy adopted or a slam dunk system, but all those things Elva said, built capacity, built a research base to clearly understand the inequities that exist. So moving along a continuum based in the best practices that we know exist around policy and system change. Elva, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to remind people, if you aren't familiar with the work of the tobacco field, for decades, I'm talking decades, all the work that happened to deal with the tobacco related illnesses and deaths, 400,000 per year, were at the individual level to get people to stop smoking. And that transition from individual to more population level took a long time. It took decades as well. But we have learned a lot from that. And we're starting off into a new approach. That's why we're doing this call, and this is why we're doing the initiative, is to really start normalizing, socializing, advancing a very strategic policy and systems change approach that builds upon those lessons. That doesn't mean it's going to be shorter. It really does require, you have to put the work in to get the results, but you have to start somewhere. And we understand fully what it's going to take, having worked on some of these other issues. And we're so grateful to the Robert Wood Johnson for their support. And it's very critical to understand that Robert Wood Johnson played a key role in the transition of tobacco control to a fully policy and systems change oriented approach that transpired during the 90s and the early 2000s. So we feel very supportive, and we feel there's enough evidence out in the field for readiness to take this on at this moment. So great question, Alfredo. Thank you for being on the call.
Thanks, Elva. And in the Changing the Landscape paper, we refer to a paper that was written by Berkeley Media Studies Group that really highlights some of the lessons around momentum building from gun control, tobacco prevention and control, alcohol prevention, and injury prevention. And I would just also encourage people to take that one additional step to look at that, to harness some of that, because this is not a short-term effort, and it's about norms change, system change, and building momentum. And as Elva says, we're early in that, but there's a roadmap for change, and it's a very exciting time. So I think I want to turn to this one. It's actually an interesting question from Liz Liz asks, just wondering about how to move a project-focused organizing effort into a policy realm. It takes people a step away from what they're most passionate about, their local park, into a more complex or citywide analysis. Elva, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to? Go ahead.
I'll start. So, you know, if you have a very engaged set of volunteers, you know, one of the things that you could start doing is to, you know, present the ideas that we've presented here today, take our materials and start educating those folks and start educating your allies. Because as we talk about in the paper, the skill sets and backgrounds of the folks who do project work versus policy work are quite distinct and not necessarily overlapping. So you want to cultivate your partners, new partners, perhaps, who are the policy advocates in your community, and start training folks, you know, on policy advocacy 101. Start training folks about the kinds of policies that have happened out there. Part of our work will be developing case studies of policy initiatives out there, but some of them are out there already. And, you know, we will sort of elevate those, but look at other national organizations. National Park and Recreation Association has done many case studies of public finance measures, for example. So it really is starting to cultivate a new approach. And to do that, you have to bring in new people, new partners, and building the capacity of the volunteers that you have. Some people may not go on that journey with you. They may only remain interested in their local park and say, I don't want to get involved in, you know, political issues, that sort of thing. And that's fine. You do need to continue, you know, building parks remains an important issue, but you're going to have to cultivate different kinds of volunteers, different kinds of staff, different kinds of allies. So that would be my quick answer.
Thanks, Elva. It's great. I see that you wanted to take Vonda's question about a summary of experts reflecting the map and presentation as examples of policy changes.
Sure. So actually, you know, the policy examples that we include in our paper were identified by Dr. Rigolone and Prevention Institute using a variety of tactics. It was, you know, it was a scan. It wasn't a full-on research project. So that's how we came up with those examples. The reality is that, you know, we're at such an early stage in this, is that, there really, besides Trust for Public Lands land vote database, which has public finance measures, there aren't a lot of tools that look at distributional equity, policies that are focused on procedural equity or structural equity. So that's something we are, as part of our work plan, is to look at that a bit deeper and really sort of see what does it take to not only identify them, but turn them around as data for consumption by a wider variety of partners.
We have a question from Shirley Lee a couple times about the P3 initiative. Will it include trails and other transportation infrastructures essential for traveling to parks? We recognize that routes to parks are critically important. Alva, do you want to speak to that, or?
Sure. This is a tough one. Trails themselves, policy related to trails, policy related to equitable policies that relate to transportation and trails, I think would be, absolutely considered. The thing about the transportation-oriented projects, oftentimes it involves money and a program. So it would be interesting to conceptualize how a policy-oriented approach to trail and transportation access would factor into it. But just like any funding initiative, people should submit their LOI and see how it goes. I mean, we can't cover every contingency or opportunity or potential opportunity. So Manal, if you have more.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, thanks for the question, Shirley. I would just add, I think one of the things that sort of for me over our trajectory has been how important, proximate and nearby access to park and recreation is. And I think the data is really starting to emerge about how important it is for people to have those within kind of ideal walking distance of their communities, as critical in terms of health and local environmental benefits. So I don't think, without seeing a proposal, if it was very compelling and there was a great idea for how trails and transportation access policy fit into a vision of creating equitable access, I think it's something to consider. But what we probably wouldn't be as interested and wouldn't be as compelling for this initiative, if that is really about getting people to travel to faraway park and recreation assets that might be, in the region. I think obviously that's very important work, but I don't see it as being central to this work, because when we think about high need park areas and maps, we're really sort of not trying to solve for moving people around large regions, but trying to solve for more localized access and more equitable distribution of park and green space resources and processes in their own communities. So I hope that didn't confuse or muddle the issue.
Sorry about that, Manal. I felt like my answer was not all that.
No, I think it was great. I just want to make sure what I said felt clear enough. Yes. We have a couple more questions. One is from Don, which I think is an interesting one about, he says there are preconceived notions of what parks are, meaning they tend to be associated with recreational program. However, from one environmental lens, parks are not always maybe what's best for addressing environmental inequities. How can we balance access to green space with the need for sensitive habitat restoration, for example?
This is an interesting question, and I think that as we now, what sensitive habitat restoration means in one community may be different what it means in another community, right? So for example, I'll use my own neighborhood. There is a 110-acre open space in my neighborhood that absolutely has sensitive habitat on it. And we worked hard to protect 20 acres of that. But at the end of the day, you know, it's not going to be, you know, there's even a bobcat that comes to the neighborhood. So if we could protect that 110 acres entirely, we would then be creating sensitive habitat restoration. So I think it's really sort of like, you know, how do you view sensitive habitat restoration as part of a equitable policy advocacy initiative that becomes sort of a multi-benefit approach, right? Certainly, this project focus on people. That's the first word of our initiative: people, power, people, parks, and power. And so, you know, that's going to be a priority for us. If there's sensitive habitat restoration outcomes, great.
And I think, Elva, just to add a little more to the power piece, which we didn't go in depth here, but we will continue to flesh that out and articulate. To Don, your question, I think a big piece of it is also who's defining the problem, who's defining the solution, and how are they centered in accomplishing it. And that will be really central, I think, to what a successful coalition or application, if that really paints a picture of people of color led coalitions and organizations organizing around a solution that improves health and environmental benefits and names a policy agenda or policy advocacy orientation to accomplishing that community's aims, that's going to be very compelling. But it's really this notion of inclusivity and changing the traditional voices that are centered in naming problems and articulating solutions and being centered, I think is going to be a key facet of this for us. Anything else to add to that, Elva? Or are we good on that one? I think we have one more open one.
I think we're pretty good. You know, I just will say that when the environmental movement started, and this is more context, the approach oftentimes was to protect the open space areas out on the urban fringe, right? A result of that was that park inequities got worse in places like Los Angeles. And I think people in the environmental movement recognize that. And so what we're trying to do is, you know, reverse those problems that have been caused over time with, you know, in some cases, well-intentioned and important, you know, strategies. We really need to look at the deplorable conditions, deplorable park inequities that are facing some communities, and do something about those. At the same time, I'm not going to say we shouldn't address sensitive habitat issues, but we have to do both.
Thanks, Elva. Guillermo, you asked the question about how we think about park and the unhoused and safety issues that many communities who lack park space bring up. How do we tackle park equity that includes inviting the unhoused to be part of the process and be welcoming with services for unhoused visitors to parks? And I think what I want to just emphasize here, you raise a very critical issue. There are some tremendous examples. I'm based in Los Angeles, and down in our Skid Row, there is a tremendous organization, nonprofit organization, that is really centering unhoused individuals in the governance and programming of that park to not only make it welcoming, but also provide services. And I would say that that would be considered for us a more project-based and service delivery orientation at a single site. So I think for the P3 initiative, blending together or braiding the issues that you talk about at a policy level and a systems change level would be kind of what takes it up into the level of this, the focus and the centerpiece of this initiative. And, you know, sort of with that, we recognize that there are so many deep community issues that are tied to parks and green space. This initiative is simply one in a rainbow and a plethora of initiatives. And many of those initiatives have, and funding streams have their own lanes. The lane that we're choosing is a policy and systems change lens to center advocacy led by power building and people of color, sort of encouraging people of color led organizations to be more centrally involved in changing the trajectory and momentum of this field. And we hope that and believe that that is a critical contribution to this field at this unprecedented moment. So we're very excited to go on this journey and have you be part of it with us as we all learn together. I want to now turn it over to Sam to show us what has emerged in the mural, and then we will shortly begin to wind down and wrap up. Sam, are you ready?
I am. Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone who was engaged on the website, the mural website. I really appreciated seeing those comments. And so what I'll do is just put the main graphic up on the big screen here. And so you can see that a few things have changed as the conversation emerged. Some original labels or titles have shifted into things that were more clear. And so what we have again is the tree metaphor with the soil underneath. So looking at people, parks, and power with the root causes, and then the equity framework, and then power building strategies on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, our playground really expanded to include some of the issues around people who were unhoused. There are some caregivers and maybe some folks in the neighborhood talking about our issues, because again, power building is happening between people. Looking at parks as a hub for resilience, and kind of the overarching kind of sunshine banner in that top there says parks and green space are essential infrastructure, not really a nice to have, but an essential infrastructure. And then here in the bottom, we've got these three kind of arrows, these big drivers pushing up. Again, what's underneath what we see is, again, the power around policy change, a systems-led local approach, and what it will look like to have equity at scale. And so I will let folks zoom in on their own time to look at this, and letting you know that the graphics will be available as well in the future. So I think, yes, I think that would be my wrap up at this stage. And again, thank you very much for all of the feedback. It was great to be able to look at those comments and bring them right into the graphic.
And can we keep the mural up in a zoomed out way so we can see kind of the whole piece just in as we kind of do some wrap up and closing remarks? Alva, I want to just let you take a moment or two to leave us with your closing thoughts.
Sure, thank you, Manal. So I just want to say what a great graphic that is, Sam. Thank you so much. It's really amazing. And I really want to thank everybody for joining us on today's call. We will very likely incorporate your questions in our FAQ for the CFP, because we know that, you know, we can't cover everything in a brief document like a CFP. So thank you for that. And just, you know, want to welcome everybody on this journey that we're starting to take. You know, while we may be managing the P3 initiative, creating a movement for park and green space equity really requires a, you know, big, diverse coalition of people who believe in a common goal. And I think everybody on this call is very likely a strong candidate for being part of that network. And I just want to thank you and encourage you, and please look to us as a resource as we move this initiative forward. And I think that's it. Thanks, Manal.
You're welcome. Thank you. Again, want to thank everybody who's been on the webinar. Our vision that we hope has really shined through today is that parks and green spaces serve every community in a fair, just manner, that they are inclusive spaces, and that some of the histories of exclusion or tokenization begin to be erased away, and that we achieve a goal I think that all of you share. Anyone who spent an hour and a half of their day on this webinar today, I think is really committed in part or whole to that vision. And Sam, thank you for being with us to create this visual. We think, again, this is just the beginning. In 10, 15 years from now, there will be even more to put on this mural about what we've learned about policy advocacy and systems change, as well as more models and examples from all around the country, from the South, East, West, and North, that happen really because of the leadership of communities, communities of color, really exercising their self-determination and establishing and realizing their goals for greater access, inclusion, and participation in the parks and open space arena and all of the fields that touch that work. So we truly do believe that parks and green spaces are essential infrastructure and that they are within reach to every community, and are eager to create a space for more centered participation of communities of color and organizations and coalitions led by communities of color, realizing that vision. We thank you so much for being here today. We look forward. Rachel has shared a number of the key dates that are upcoming, and we look forward to seeing you and engaging with you between now and then, and at those points coming up along the horizon. Thank you so much for all your contributions and your participation. Have a great rest of your day.